So we have been exploring together Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly. And we have been looking at what it means to learn to get comfortable with being vulnerable and why getting comfortable being vulnerable is so important. Today we're going to be taking a look at the idea of how do we drop the shield. Brené says most of us are walking around with the shield, trying to protect ourselves from being hurt, trying to protect ourselves from ever feeling shame or embarrassment, and so we walk around with this shield. And the challenge with that is that shield that we think is protecting us from ever being hurt also keeps us playing very small, keeps us from being able to really connect in any sort of meaningful way, deep way with another person. It keeps us from being ourselves and being seen. And so she explains that we need to know what those shields are, what makes up the shield, and we need to be willing to begin to peel away some of the layers. And we're going to take a look at two very specific things she talks about. But a little bit of a recap. She speaks about this importance of vulnerability. And she says that vulnerability is to be scared, but to do it anyway. It is to not know how, but to try anyway. It is to feel self-conscious, but show up anyway. It is to not have a clue of the outcome, but take a risk anyway. It is to be afraid of getting hurt, but opening up your heart anyway. It is to feel naked, but be authentic and real anyway. Vulnerability, that kind of vulnerability, doesn't come too easily or too naturally for most of us anymore as adults. You know, at one time it did. When we were very young children, we had no problem being ourselves. That's who we were, naturally, authentically, easily. We were comfortable inside of our own skin. And somewhere along the line for most of us, we started to become self-conscious, didn't we? We started to pick up on things about us that maybe we were told somehow weren't okay. And for many of us, we have grown into adults that do have a shield around us that keeps us from really being authentically ourselves or letting ourselves be truly seen because we're so afraid of being hurt again. That deep beneath that, for many of us, is this feeling of not quite good enough. How many of you remember John Bradshaw, the teacher about 30 years ago out of the recovery movement that did so much work? In fact, I think he really was the first to speak and teach broadly and deeply about the topic of shame and the consequences of shame. His best-selling book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, was all about the toxic shame that many people are living with because of having been abused as a child or having experienced some sort of trauma in their life or some sort of serious neglect, and how many of them turn to drugs or alcohol to try to numb that. And so his work 30 years ago was all about shame, but more shame out of a very toxic kind of experience in the past. And he helped a lot of people to begin to move through that. Brené Brown's work is a little bit different, though it's still on the topic of shame. Brené Brown's work is more on what she would call normal shame. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Say that with me. Normal shame. She says it's kind of like a low-grade fever. It's kind of often always there, and it basically stems from this feeling that many of us have of just somehow not being quite good enough, not smart enough, not strong enough, not successful enough, not good-looking enough, not thin enough, not pretty enough, not handsome enough. What are some of the other not enoughs? There's plenty of them, right? Just somehow not quite enough. And that not enough feeling keeps us holding back and not stepping into the arena and not really living wholeheartedly like we would have or did when we were a child. We weren't afraid, but somehow as an adult, we've clothed ourselves or shielded ourselves from being comfortable trying, being comfortable doing new things, being comfortable letting ourselves be seen. So Brené suggests that there are two pieces in our arsenal that keeps us from being seen. And the first, I really struggled with this. When I first started looking at this in her work, I really struggled with it. She calls it foreboding joy. She says it's foreboding joy, or the paradoxical dread that clamps down around momentary joyfulness. But the beautiful thing is that in Brené's research, what she found as she talked to the people who would experience some of that foreboding joy, that the ones who didn't stay there and wind up dismantling the good in their lives were, what they practiced was a very key practice, the practice of gratitude. That was the antidote. She writes, even those who have learned to lean into joy and embrace their experiences, their good experiences, are not immune to the uncomfortable quake of vulnerability that often accompanies joyful moments. They've just learned how to use it as a reminder rather than a warning shot. What was the most surprising and life-changing difference was the nature of that reminder. For those welcoming the experience, the shudder of vulnerability that accompanies joy is an invitation to practice gratitude.